Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours, the travel company led by reporters around the world. My name's Owen Bennett-Jones and I'm sitting in today for Nicholas Wood, and we're discussing the Israeli pager attacks on Hezbollah and everything that's happened since and what might happen next. And to do that, we really could have no one better. We've got Nicholas Blanford, who's lived in Beirut for decades, is very well known for his knowledge of Hezbollah, and used to be a journalist. I have to say, I was in Beirut once. He's extremely generous with his time and knowledge, as I did a report on Rafi Hariri, the erstwhile Lebanese prime minister who was assassinated. And he is now working with the Atlantic Council and is still very involved with monitoring what's going on with Hezbollah. So really, he is the person to speak to about how these attacks across the border are affecting Hezbollah and what we can expect next. So, well, first of all, welcome to you.
Thank you, Owen. Glad to be here.
And I think we should just do this chronologically if we can, because I've been reading accounts in the newspapers and I've still not got a completely clear picture in my mind as to how on earth those pager attacks were done. But it seems like the whole manufacture of them was by a front company. It wasn't like they infiltrated a company that was making them. They created a company that made them. Is that right?
Well, that seems to be where the reporting is leading at the moment. I mean, this is a story that's still being investigated, and it's still a little bit murky. But it seems that the Israelis were able to insert themselves in the supply chain at some point. So apparently there was a Hungarian company that was supposed to have manufactured these pages under license from a Taiwanese company. I think both companies have actually denied involvement in this, but somehow, somewhere, the Israelis, presumably Mossad, the Israeli intelligence agency, was able to get involved in this and to booby trap the pages with a very small amount of explosive, an ounce or two each. But how they were able to infiltrate the supply chain, knowing that these pages were going to be bought by Hezbollah, we still don't know that. But it was obviously a very sophisticated operation, and it took a long time to plan.
Yeah, the Taiwanese factory owner, I saw an interview with him saying, I sold the license and it was very difficult because payments were erratic and oddly came from the Middle East, even though I sold to Hungary. So
that's right.
That's part of it. And then just talk us through the first wave and the second wave, because I cannot understand how Hezbollah did not understand after the first wave that all their communications were vulnerable and they needed to take action, which they failed to do, right?
Usually Hezbollah has a very airtight sense of security. And I would imagine that when these pages were delivered into Lebanon, that they would have done at least a cursory check to see that everything is okay. Now, it's quite possible, I'm no expert on this, of course, so I can only repeat what I've been reading from people who are experts, that it is possible that the explosives were very well disguised as part of the battery pack or whatever. And the pages, obviously a pager is a very small piece of kit, a communication device. And in fact, Hezbollah has been going back to pages of late because earlier on in the year, when they were using cell phones, and the Israelis were able to track down senior Hezbollah commanders through cell phone signals. And Hassan Nasrallah, the leader of Hezbollah, gave a speech early in the year saying, right, get rid of all your cell phones. So they did, and some of the senior Hezbollah commanders would swap cars multiple times a day, no cell phones, no pagers even. Some of the guys that I talked to are now quite senior, carried no electronic communications devices whatsoever. But nonetheless, the pages were distributed to the various cadres, so they wouldn't have all been fighters. Some would have been medics, people working in the civilian administration. And around 3:30 on Tuesday afternoon, they simultaneously exploded. The kind of injuries that resulted, bearing in mind that the pages, the small amount of explosive, not necessarily deadly, but normally you keep your pager on your belt. So the signal went out, and a lot of the Hezbollah guys would pick up the pager and look at it to read the message when it would explode. So a lot of them lost hands and fingers. A lot of them were very badly damaged in the face, lost eyesight. For those that didn't actually pick up the pager and would have it on their belt, then their midriff would have very bad injuries, kidneys being hit and that kind of thing. Then the second day, this was on Tuesday, on the Wednesday, it was a turn of the walkie-talkies. So the Israelis apparently been able to intercept a consignment of walkie-talkies, which are much larger than pagers. So a comparatively larger amount of explosive was inserted into the walkie-talkies, and these had a much more deadly effect. So I think 450 people were wounded by the walkie-talkies, 20, I think, were killed. With the pagers, 12 were killed, and almost 3,000 were wounded. So that was a considerable number of people being harmed in just a 2-day period.
It's interesting what you say about them giving up the electronic communication. Bin Laden, when he was hiding in Abbottabad in Pakistan, was urged to have more communication with his people because he'd had very little communication. And he was being given phones and ways of communicating. And he just said, it is not our technology. We don't use it.
Yeah.
And he was right, really, from his point of view, because he was there for a long time without being detected.
Yeah, absolutely. And this is why some of the senior cadres, I mean, even famously, Nasrallah has never touched a cell phone in his life.
Really?
They're now having to rethink I mean, you have to bear in mind that not all the pages that Hezbollah carried blew up. It was only one particular consignment. So there were plenty of guys walking around on Tuesday afternoon, and when their comrades were being injured, their pages were perfectly intact because they were either older, they came from different consignment, and the same with the walkie-talkies as well.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Nasrallah, and I wanted to ask you about Hassan Nasrallah. He's such a sort of important figure in Hezbollah. He's been there for so long. Can you just talk us through, who he is, what he thinks?
When Hassan Nasrallah's predecessor, Abbas Musawi, was killed in 1992 in an Israeli helicopter strike, he was the Secretary General of Hezbollah, Abbas Musawi, and he had been the leader of Hezbollah's resistance against Israel during the 1980s. And when he was killed, it was an enormous shock within Hezbollah. And the cadres were thinking, how can we continue without Sayyid Abbas? 2 days later, Hezbollah's Central Shura Council elected Musawi's protege, Hassan Nasrallah, as Secretary General. And indeed, Nasrallah has outshone even Musawi over the years. Back then, in the early 90s, a Secretary General could serve, I think it was 3 consecutive 3-year terms in office. But by the time he was coming to the end of his 3rd term, it was clear that his importance as a leader, not just of Hezbollah, but increasingly as a leader of a kind of a regional figure. He wasn't just a Lebanese politician, a Shia cleric. He's becoming a regional politician, a regional leader. So they scrapped that decree, and he's been Secretary General for, 32 years now. He's very charismatic, and he's a great orator, and he has a reputation. The Israelis will hang on every word he says in his speech. They will parse it and analyze it. He has a reputation for more or less telling the truth. He is a politician at the end of the day. There's always an amount of spin and so on. But when he delivers a threat, the Israelis tend to take it very seriously. So, he's been helming this current conflict, and he's had a very strong line about maintaining what they call the support front for Hamas in Gaza for as long as the war in Gaza continues. And even after the spate of casualties earlier on last week, with the pager attacks and the walkie-talkie attacks, he was saying, fine, you hit us as you wish. You can find our senior commanders, you can kill them, but we are not stopping our support front for Hamas until the war in Gaza comes to an end.
Does he have any freedom of movement from Iran, or is he simply taking their orders?
It depends. The strategy is set by the Iranians, but the tactical day-to-day activities are set by Hezbollah. So, for example, in the early 1990s, the Iranians told Hezbollah, right, continue with your resistance campaign against the Israeli occupation of South Lebanon, and we want these guys forced out of your country. How that was achieved was up to Hezbollah. Similarly, when Hezbollah moved more deeply into Lebanese politics, that had the blessing of the Iranians, but the Iranians don't call up Nasrallah every day and give orders about how to behave in the Lebanese political milieu, because they know perfectly well that Hezbollah and Nasrallah in particular are much better placed to determine the best interest of Hezbollah and therefore the best interest of Iran in Lebanese politics. So the tactics are basically left up to Hezbollah, but the strategy will be left up to the Iranians.
As ever, can I encourage you to ask questions? I think we had some issue the other day when we did this, but the chat definitely worked. So if you leave a message in chat, also try and raise your hand perhaps, and I hope I'll be able to see it, but the chat box definitely works. So if you've got something you'd like to ask about, it's good if you just do it as the conversation goes on, and I will try to include you. So we had the pager attack and then the walkie-talkie attack. And all the while, there's been an exchange of fire across the border going on for the best part of a year now.
Yes. So, I mean, this all kicked off the day after Hamas staged its mass assault on what they call the Gaza envelope, the communities and the military posts surrounding Gaza. And when that happened, it was expected that Hezbollah would chuck in their 2 cents with a kind of an attack, which would be a demonstration of support for the Hamas allies. And that happened the next day on October the 8th. So they attacked a bunch of Israeli positions in an area called the Sheba Farms. This is an Israeli-occupied mountainside along Lebanon's southeast border. The Israelis have been there since 1967. And it's been seen really since 2000, when the Israelis pulled out of the bulk of South Lebanon, as a kind of messaging ground. So if Hezbollah is unhappy with the Israelis over any particular action, they can lob a few mortar rounds in the Israeli compounds in the Sheba Farms, and that's it. But on October the 9th, the day after Hezbollah's first attack, we had a group of Palestinian Islamic Jihad fighters in Lebanon try to slip across the border into Israel. There was a firefight. An Israeli colonel was killed in the firefight. The Israelis shelled back quite heavily into Lebanon, killing some Hezbollah people. So Hezbollah retaliated to that. And suddenly you went to this daily tit-for-tat strike and counter-strike, which has only gradually escalated, particularly since April, really. It's escalated and become more and more intense on a daily basis, leading to the current conflagration that we have now.
Now, I'm not clear. I mean, I know that was it 60,000 people have moved from those villages in northern Israel because there's so much Hezbollah munitions coming in that it's just not safe for them. I actually spoke to a woman who'd stayed behind, but she was one of very few. And most people have left that area. What I'm not clear about is how effective these Hezbollah missile strikes are in terms of killing soldiers or Israelis. Are they being killed civilians by these Hezbollah munitions coming in?
Very few casualties. Given the amount of ordnance that Hezbollah is throwing into Israel every day, there are very few casualties on the Israeli side, to the extent that a lot of Lebanese don't believe the casualty figures that the Israeli government issues about their soldiers.
You believe them?
They don't believe them. They say, no,
you believe them?
The Lebanese believe that the Israelis are lying about the casualty figures, and they think that the casualty toll is actually far higher. I mean, I can't say, but in my experience, the Israelis don't usually cover up casualties because it's impossible to do it in a country like Israel. The word will get out. But part of the reason for that is that, yes, you have around 60, 70, 80,000 Israelis have been evacuated from settlements, communities to a depth of around 5 kilometers from the Lebanon-Israel border. Some remain. A lot of the civilian houses are now serve as billets for Israeli troops that are deployed up to the border. So the Israeli soldiers are not just deployed in border outposts, they're staying in civilian houses as well. But part of the reason, I think, for the relatively low casualty count on the Israeli side is that Hezbollah is really using legacy systems, legacy weapon systems, the old stuff that they've been using for decades. We're talking about Katyusha rockets, which is an old Russian system that was being used in World War II. They're using some Russian anti-tank missiles that date from the 1960s. They have been using more advanced anti-tank missile systems as well. But by and large, the rockets that they've been firing into Israel are unguided, not particularly accurate. Most of them don't have a particularly large warhead. Now, Hezbollah does have a much larger arsenal with some very sophisticated precision-guided sub-ballistic missiles with 500-kilogram warheads that can strike within 10 to 20 meters of their target. Those are on hold. The Iranians have not given permission for Hezbollah to use them. And I have to say, to the frustration of a lot of Hezbollah fighters, and I spoke to one at the beginning of April in South Lebanon, a veteran guy I've known for years. And he was saying at the time, this is a futile war. What are we doing, putting holes in a road in Israel with our antiquated rockets? The Israelis are decimating our villages. They're finding our commanders somehow and killing them. And we're not able to use the really good stuff that we have to inflict some pain on the Israelis.
So explain that to us. Why is that happening? Why are they being restrained?
Because this is the bottom line here. Hezbollah is a key component of Iran's deterrence architecture. It's been a massive force enabler for Iran to extend its influence across the region, particularly since the war in Syria began. Hezbollah has played a very key role in defending the regime of Bashar al-Assad, who is a key ally, of course, of Iran and of Hezbollah. Hezbollah has played a role in Iraq, particularly as part of the anti-ISIS coalition. Hezbollah has played a role in Yemen, training up the Houthis. Hezbollah has been involved in firing some of the long-range rocket systems from Yemen into Saudi Arabia, effectively getting live fire practice on systems that one day they may use from Lebanon into Israel. So this is a critically important component of Iranian deterrence. And the Iranians do not want to see Hezbollah wasted in what would be ultimately a futile war with Israel for the sake of Hamas in Gaza. Hamas is an important ally to Iran, but up to a point, Hezbollah is much, much more important. And this is generating some unhappiness, particularly in the last week. And I've been talking to a lot of Hezbollah supporters who are saying, we need to inflict pain on the Israelis. This is ridiculous. You know, our guys are being hit, our pages are blowing up, our walkie-talkies are blowing up. We can fire ballistic missiles into the Ministry of Defense in Tel Aviv, but the Iranians are not allowing us to do it. So even some Hezbollah fighters are grumbling about this now. But the Iranians are looking at the long term. The Hezbollah leadership is very aware of the sentiment of the grassroots cadres who want revenge. They want blood. They want retaliation for what's been going on in Lebanon. But the Hezbollah leadership, under the watchful eye of the Iranians, has to look at the longer term picture.
And am I right in thinking that the reason the Iranians are saying hold back for the moment is that they're quite close to the bomb, the nuclear device? Maybe they've not made the decision to do it. Maybe they have, but they're close. And there must be thinking, I'd have thought, in Tehran that, look, there's no point having a war with Israel now when in 3 years, 4 years, 5 years, we can do it and we'll be nuclear.
Exactly. So the point of investing all this money in Hezbollah, building up its capacity, building up its weapons storage, its weapon systems and so on, ever more advanced weapon systems, particularly since 2006, is basically that anyone, whether it's the Israelis or the Americans, are thinking, it's time to go after the Iranians. We need to either decapitate the regime, launch some kind of preemptive strike to take out their nuclear facilities. But then they have to think, well, hang on, if we do that, what is Hezbollah in Lebanon going to do? So they have to factor this in. And for the Iranians, that's a useful component of its deterrence structure.
Just to explain that then, if the constraint was taken off, let's say the Iranians thought they were about to be attacked or were attacked by an Israeli or American force, what could Hezbollah do? How powerful are they in terms of the damage they could inflict on Israel if they use these more modern weapon systems you're talking about?
Yes, they can inflict significant damage. The weapon systems they have now have the ability to cover the entire geography of Israel. If the balloon goes up and we have a full-scale war, Israel goes into lockdown for the duration. That means no one is going to school, no one's going to university, no one's going to work. You're going to be in the bomb shelters for the duration. There'll be no commercial aviation traffic. There'll be no commercial civilian maritime traffic. Hezbollah has anti-ship missiles that will effectively impose a naval blockade along the entire coastline of Israel. Its ballistic missiles will take out infrastructure in Israel. It will certainly take out military targets, air bases and the like. So it'll be something that the Israelis haven't seen since 1948. And I think the Israelis, particularly the Israeli military, are very aware of this. And they factor this into their various calculations when they're planning their offensive against Hezbollah.
So just a reminder that now's a good time to ask questions. We've been talking for 20 minutes or so. If anyone wants to ask something of Nicholas, then just do indicate in the chat box or put your hand up and we'll get you involved in the conversation. So you're describing a situation in which Hezbollah does have, real heft in this. Now, the Israelis are attacking daily now, I guess. I presume I'm right in saying that. Are they effectively destroying? I mean, you talk to Hezbollah, or at least Hezbollah supporters. Are they destroying those modern weapon systems or not?
Very hard to say. The Israelis today said they've hit thousands of Hezbollah's longer range rockets. The last 2 days, they've been hitting very heavily with multiple airstrikes across the country, mainly in Shia populated areas of Lebanon, where Hezbollah has support, where they have bases, training camps, and so on and so forth. At this stage, it's very hard to assess the amount of damage that's been inflicted. But Hezbollah is still pouring fire into Israel. And bearing in mind that the systems they're using are relatively short range, that means they're firing them from South Lebanon into Israel. And South Lebanon has been under intense artillery and airstrikes, going back months, but particularly over the last 48 hours or so, but they're still firing them.
Now, it just occurs to me, you talk about the frustration of Hezbollah fighters and supporters who are sitting there saying, why are we not doing something? Is there a sense in which some of those Hezbollah elements may be thinking, well, look, I actually want to defend Lebanon. I don't particularly want to defend Iran. I'm a Lebanese. And my interest is in preventing an Israeli attack or an occupation of southern Lebanon. That's my goal. I'm not really bothered about what happens to Iran, at least not as much as I am as what happens to Lebanon. Is there a sort of split like that?
I wouldn't say there's a split per se. The ideology of Hezbollah, what they call the Vilayat al-Faqih, is very much linked spiritually, religiously to Iran. So the supreme leader of Iran is effectively the leader of Hezbollah. So if you were to do a flow chart, if you like, and some have in the past, you would start with God, Allah, you go to the Prophet Muhammad, then you go to the supreme leader, then you go to the Secretary General of Hezbollah, which is Nasrallah, and then it branches out into all the various formations. But at the end of the day, even though your average Hezbollah guy will subscribe to this ideological system, they're human. And when they're seeing their comrades being blown to pieces, their villages being destroyed, then it becomes a kind of more, if you like, a more primitive urge of revenge. They want to strike back. They want to lash out. So your average Hezbollah guy on the ground won't be thinking about strategy. They won't necessarily be thinking about the greater interests, not only of Iran, but of Hezbollah. It doesn't suit Hezbollah to get into a massive war with Israel, because irrespective of the outcome, Hezbollah will take a huge battering. And there's no guarantee in the aftermath that Hezbollah will be able to re-equip, rebuild, rearm as quickly as it did after the last war in 2006 to continue serving as a component of deterrence for Iran. So it's very much a gut kind of instinctive feeling amongst the cadres on the ground. They're seeing Lebanon being battered, their comrades being killed. They want to strike back and cause some pain, but they're not looking at it necessarily on the strategic level.
I hope I'm going to get the pronunciation correct. Lois, have I got that right?
Correct. Lois as in Lane,
Okay.
For those of you who spent their childhood reading comics.
Nice to speak to you. And what's your question?
Really, when you're looking at the whole conflict from both the Israeli and essentially the Lebanese point of view, there are entrenched parties on both sides, and that I mean the more senior parties, who actually benefit from the ongoing conflict. It entrenches their power. In a way, this adds a sort of layer to the conflict in that they're going to keep driving at a strategic level when really at the ground level, there's an awful lot of pain being experienced.
Yes, I would say maybe more on the Israeli side than the Lebanese side, because Hezbollah...
I was thinking the Iranian side.
Sorry?
I was thinking on the Iranian side as well, because they're driving the Lebanese.
Absolutely. No, the Iranians... I think the Iranians are probably a little uneasy about what's happening right now over the last week in Lebanon. But they also see over the last year the turmoil in Israel, not only from the Hamas attack, which sparked all this back in October last year, but we've seen the attitude, sort of international sympathy. I mean, in a way, I think that the Netanyahu government completely wasted the international sympathy that was generated after October the 7th last year. They played it very badly. They rushed in to Gaza without thinking about an end game. It's almost like a biblical act of revenge, blood revenge, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. Obviously, what had happened on October the 7th was unprecedented for Israel, was shocking for the Israelis. But I think cooler heads at the time, if they had prevailed, they could have exploited far more advantage out of this on the international level. We see that the Netanyahu government really has just frittered away whatever sympathy it could have had. And we see the Biden administration. I mean, President Biden, has been pulling out what's left of his hair in frustration at the Netanyahu government's actions, and he's been imploring Netanyahu not to open another front with Lebanon, but that front has now been opened, and what was a fairly low-scale kind of daily tit-for-tat attacks, which fell well short of that kind of threshold, which if crossed leads to all-out war. Well, now it's right up close to that threshold. So that may suit the interests of the Netanyahu government. It certainly suits the interests of the Iranians to see all this turmoil in Israel. And the fact that Israel has not only come under attack from Hezbollah, from Hamas, but the Houthis have been involved. There's been the odd rocket and drone attack coming out of Syria and Iraq. So there's a sense that in some respects, Israel is on the back toe. So that does suit Iran. For Hezbollah, I think personally the Hezbollah leadership would wish this all ended a long time ago, months ago. I don't think they were expecting this to get into a daily tit-for-tat pattern. It took Nasrallah almost a month when this kicked off to actually make his first speech. And it was almost as if Hezbollah was waiting to see, where is this going to go? Is this going to stop in a week or two? Or is it going to continue? And they waited a month before making the Nasrallah's first speech. Right now, I think, in a way, Hezbollah, I mean, they're not getting an advantage out of this situation at all. They're being pummeled, but they've backed themselves into a corner. So when the Hezbollah leadership, Nasrallah, says, right, we'll continue with the support front until the war in Gaza ends. And that is music to the ears of Yahya Sinwar, the Hamas leader, who's sitting in his tunnel in Gaza and thinking, well, I'm in no rush. It suits my interest to have Israel fighting Hezbollah along the Lebanon-Israel border. So in a way, the fate of Hezbollah, the fate of Lebanon, is very much down to the whims and the plans and intentions of Sinwar. And I don't think Hezbollah is very happy about that. But by the same token, they cannot say, we give up, we've had enough, we did our bit, back to you, Hamas. This is not in Hezbollah's DNA, because that would be tantamount to surrender. And that's a total anathema to Hezbollah. And if they were to do that, there would be a very heavy day of reckoning in Lebanon. You have to remember, most Lebanese are seething at having been dragged, the country being dragged into a potentially devastating conflict. Hezbollah didn't ask the Lebanese if they minded if they opened up a support front. And if they were to surrender, there would be a backlash from their core Shia community as well, who've borne the brunt, particularly in the border villages in the south. They've borne the brunt of this. They've lost livelihoods, they've lost homes, they've lost relatives. And if Hezbollah suddenly says, well, we give up, then that's going to be very bad news down the road for Hezbollah. So they have to keep going and just keep the fingers crossed that the Qataris, the Egyptians, the Americans can effect sooner rather than later a ceasefire in Gaza, which will then have a trickle-down effect along the Lebanon-Israel border.
Let's bring in Diane Cook. Diane.
Yes, it's sort of moved on slightly from where I started my question. But as you're describing, Nicholas, is there a concern that actually Hezbollah on the ground, as it were, with all the things that you were just talking about, actually decides to fire the weapons, the good weapons, and, it takes the thing to a whole different level? And I suppose a sort of subsidiary question is, do they have the ability to fire the Iranian supplied missiles without something from Iran, in the way that Ukraine wants to use American weapons, but they can't use the GPS?
Yeah, it's a good analogy. I mean, there's a very tight sense of discipline within Hezbollah. So even though, as I was saying, the Hezbollah guys on the ground, they want to unleash these more sophisticated systems and make the Israelis bleed, but they're not going to do it. You're not going to get some rogue commander in South Lebanon who says, to hell with this, we're going to fire our Fatah 110 sub-ballistic missiles with a 500-kilogram warhead and take out Ben Gurion Airport, for example. The chain of command is much stronger than that. So they may be frustrated, but they will not fire those systems until somebody in Tehran picks up the phone, calls Nasrallah and says, go for it.
But it's a sort of verbal lock with Iran rather than a technical one, is it?
Hard to say, but I think the level of trust between the Iranians and Hezbollah, when you come to that kind of level of coordination between them, I don't think the Iranians need to give Hezbollah a key and say, right, you can use it now, unlock the system, and off you go.
So much of this depends on the Israeli perception of Iran's intentions, because if Israel thinks that Iran really is trying to avoid a war for whatever reason, to protect its nuclear program or whatever its thinking is, then it's got a free hand, really, to bomb southern Lebanon for as long as it likes, knowing that actually, despite all the media stuff, it's not going to escalate.
Well, yes, that's true. And I think that's what the Israelis are gambling on. If we go back a few weeks, the Israelis killed Hezbollah's top military commander, a guy called Fuad Shukr, at the end of July. And this was a big slap for Hezbollah. He was killed in southern Beirut. It was only the second time the Israelis have attacked southern Beirut since this began. So there had to be some form of retaliation. But it took almost a month for Hezbollah to effect this retaliation. And it was fairly lackluster in the greater scheme of things. They sent 350 drones and rockets into Israel, some quite deep. I don't think there were any casualties on the Israeli side. Hezbollah tried to spin it that there were casualties. But I know from talking with the support base, they were very disappointed. They wanted, for the killing Fuad Shukr, that deserves rockets going into Tel Aviv. And this didn't happen. And I think the Israelis at that point concluded that maybe we can up our aggression against Hezbollah, because it's obvious now the Iranians do not want Hezbollah to get into war. It's a gamble, but they can go too far. Over the last week, they have been very clear to stick to Hezbollah targets. So they haven't done what they have done in the past, and that is to go for Lebanese infrastructure targets. So they haven't been hitting the bridges, they haven't been hitting roads, power stations, not as much power these days in Lebanon anyway. I'm in the UK right now. I came here a couple of days ago, and I'm going back to Beirut on Saturday, and I'm counting the hours to going back in case things do escalate and Beirut airport goes up in smoke. And it's a long swim back to Beirut from Cyprus. So I'm hoping that if the Israelis maintain this aggressive posture, that it sticks to military targets, Hezbollah targets, rather than going for the infrastructure. But I think by the same calculation, I think the Israelis understand if they do start hitting infrastructure, then that's almost going to force the Hezbollah to start hitting Iranian infrastructure. And then you're getting even closer to that threshold moment of all-out war.
We asked you earlier about the damage in northern Israel. Can you compare what's happened in those communities in northern Israel and what's happened in southern Lebanon? Who's taken the most damage? Do you have any sense of comparative casualty figures?
Well, the casualty figures are much higher on the Lebanese side. So I think after today, we've had nearly 300 people killed. And I think I read one report, that's the highest number of casualties in Lebanon in a single day since the end of the 1975-1990 civil war. So that's quite a significant toll. And that being the case, then we're nudging, I guess, between 800, 900 casualties altogether since this kicked off. On the Israeli side, I think Off the top of my head, I think around 20 Israeli soldiers have been killed and a handful of civilians. The damage is far greater on the Lebanese side, simply because the Israelis wield far greater firepower. Also, on the Lebanese side, the Lebanese don't have bunkers. They don't have bomb shelters they can run into. So when the balloon goes up, traditionally, the southern Lebanese will jump into a car, put the mattresses on the roof, get their suitcases, make sure they got their passports, and take that long, familiar drive north to get out of the firing zone in the south. So some villages down there are completely empty. There are a few Christian populated villages where the populations are more or less intact because Hezbollah hasn't been firing from those villages. And the Israelis, by the same token, realize that these are not hostile population areas. But I suspect that given the escalation of the last 48 hours, there'll be very few Lebanese, Christian, Muslim, whatever, staying in the immediate border villages.
I've got a question from George. George.
Excuse me if this has been covered in detail. What are the Israelis seeking to achieve? I mean, I can imagine a number of things I would like to achieve, but what do you think they are seeking to achieve?
Well, there are two primary goals right now in terms of Lebanon and Hezbollah. Is first of all to drive Hezbollah back from the border, and whether it's 5 kilometers, 8 kilometers, 10 kilometers, they don't want Hezbollah on the border peering into Israeli communities anymore. The second thing they want, of course, is to be able to bring their 60, 70,000 citizens who've evacuated their homes in the north back to their communities. Now, the thing is that the Israelis have greatly escalated their actions over the last week to put pressure on Hezbollah to acquiesce to these goals, these Israeli goals. It's not going to work. Hezbollah will not yield. They will not surrender. They will not give up. So in a way, they're taking a very heavy punishment at Hezbollah right now. But all they need to do is to keep firing rockets, missiles into northern Israel, causing as much damage as they can, firing perhaps deeper into Israel, maybe using new systems, larger systems, as they have done, in fact, over the last couple of days, to reach a little bit deeper into Israel, but still saving the really good stuff for a rainy day. Under such conditions, clearly Hezbollah is not going to be moving back from the border, and clearly the Israeli citizens are not going to be able to go back to their homes. So you have a kind of a very dangerous, potentially prolonged stalemate where the Israelis are smashing Hezbollah wherever they can find them, but Hezbollah is still entrenched deep enough in South Lebanon and elsewhere in the country to maintain the flow of rockets into Israel. For example, the day after the pager attack, when a lot of Hezbollah's communications went on the blink, Hezbollah staged 16 attacks into Israel. So that would have been on the Wednesday. 16 is right at the upper end of the number of attacks. Actually, no, sorry, it was 17 on that day. And that's at the upper end of daily attacks. Usually it's between 5, 9, maybe 10, 11. And they did 16 the following day. And the types of weapons they were firing were mainly rockets going deeper into Israel. Usually the average attack by Hezbollah is an anti-tank missile attack against an Israeli border position, which is quite limited. An anti-tank missile doesn't have a huge explosive charge. But Hezbollah was really making the point, yes, you hit us with the pagers, you hit us with the walkie-talkies. 2 days after that, the Israelis staged a devastating airstrike in southern Beirut. They killed the commander, Hezbollah's top operations commander, who also heads Hezbollah's most elite special forces fighting unit, along with 11 other very senior military commanders. But Hezbollah is still operating in South Lebanon, very close to the Lebanon-Israel border, and firing those rockets into Israel. So yes, I mean, as Owen was asking earlier, can we assess what kind of damage has been inflicted on Hezbollah? At this stage, we can't. But in some ways, the proof is in the pudding that Hezbollah is still maintaining the flow of rocketry into Israel on a daily basis.
Yeah, at the same time, it just occurs to me that with all these senior leaders being hit, in these targeted assassinations, and also in Iran, and I think in Damascus as well, wasn't it? There must be internal deep anxiety in Hezbollah and indeed in Iran about their intelligence problems. I mean, they have been penetrated, right? And
yes.
Do they know how to deal with that?
I don't think they do, to be honest. And this is, Hezbollah has always prided itself on its sense of internal security and secrecy. It's a very secretive organization. If you go back to the 1990s, when it was a much, much smaller organization, and they were very much focused in those days on fighting the Israeli occupation in South Lebanon. And me as a journalist back then, if I wanted to get to talk to a Hezbollah fighter outside a media office, forget it. It just wouldn't happen. If I wanted to talk to a fighter, I'd have to make an application with the media office, and then they would bring someone in. After the 2006 war, they expanded very quickly. So maybe they had around 5,000 full-time and part-time fighters before 2006. After 2006, the numbers immediately jumped 10,000, 20, 30, 40, 50. Last year, Nasrallah was boasting they've got 100,000 fighters, which is probably an exaggeration, but we are talking now about tens of thousands of fighters. Now, in a small country, when you suddenly expand like that over a very short period of time, cracks can emerge. And it was possible for nosy journalists like me to be able to worm your way in. You meet somebody, he's got a friend, introduces you, he's a veteran Hezbollah guy, he's a bit wary at first, you build up a relationship, you become kind of friends. And this can happen. If I can do it as a British journalist, a sort of pink-faced journalist going in, then they're susceptible then to being penetrated by hostile intelligence agencies. And this is clearly what's happened. The Israelis have burrowed deep now. So going back to the airstrike a couple of days ago, where they killed Hezbollah's top operations officer and a dozen other guys, very few people would have been aware this meeting was being held, very few. And they would have all been senior guys. So that may help with Hezbollah's internal investigation to find the mole. But what does it say about Hezbollah's internal cohesion, internal unity, sense of secrecy, if the Israelis can tap into that level of the hierarchy and exploit that intelligence to commit a devastating assassination attack?
We'll take a question from George. Now's the time, if you've got a question, to raise your hand, because we'll close it after questions from those attending. So, George.
The commitment from Iran and Hezbollah is an ideological commitment to destroy Israel. Does this ever end? Do people get tired of this? I was thinking of the 30 Years' War. Do people eventually get tired of trying to destroy each other? I don't know.
Well, I mean, Hezbollah has been doing this now for, 42 years, since Israel's 1982 invasion, and the Hezbollah emerged in the aftermath. Hezbollah is an organization that very much looks to the long term. So when you join Hezbollah, you're not just joining a militia or a political party, you're joining a way of life. And the recruitment process very often starts at a very young age. So now you have generations of Hezbollah fighters. Your grandfather, joined in 1982. His son joined in the 1990s. The grandson would have been growing up in this environment of resistance against Israel. When he's 6 years old, he might dress up in a military uniform, carry a plastic M16 and walk in the annual Jerusalem Day parade. By the time he's 13 or 14, he's attending one of Hezbollah's schools, being indoctrinated in the cultural and ideological ethos of Hezbollah. They might go in the summer holidays on scouting camps with Hezbollah, learning how to climb ropes, maybe shoot a rifle. And by the time they're 18 years old and eligible to join the Islamic resistance, the military wing, they are fully committed and on board. Now, having said that, Lebanon has been going through a very chaotic period over the last, 5 years. We had a big economic collapse in October 2019, soaring inflation, people's bank accounts have been wiped out. 80% of the Lebanese living below the poverty line now. And that includes many Shia. The Shia are quite a generally poor part of the population. So suddenly the ideas of resistance against Israel, liberating Holy Jerusalem, liberating Palestine, for many Lebanese Shias, this is a luxury they can't afford. They need to find ways of getting money so they can put food on the table for their families. So there has been a kind of a growing mood, I think, within the Shia community that they're beginning to feel the weight of Hezbollah on their shoulders. It's almost a bit like this huge burden that we have to go to Hezbollah rallies and wave the flag and support Nasrallah and support the resistance. But at the end of the day, I've got to go off for work and get some food on the table for the family meal in the evening. Nothing lasts forever, and Hezbollah's had a good run. And I've been covering this organization for nearly 30 years, and I've watched it grow from a very tightly focused, very clever, very smart guerrilla organization with relatively rudimentary weapons into by far the most formidable non-state military actor in the world. But it's come at a cost. And I won't go into all the details now because it's a long story, but they've had to become involved in Lebanese politics. That's led to corruption within the ranks of Hezbollah, people feeling the weight of Hezbollah. They've had to forge political alliances with other actors in Lebanon who are corrupt and venal and transactional and a headache to deal with, quite frankly. So I wrote a book about Hezbollah some years ago, kind of a military history, and I defined the situation where they are now as they've kind of come up the hill, they've crested it, they're not going down yet, and if they do, it's going to probably be a long downhill, but they're walking a corridor that's getting ever narrower, so their margins of maneuver are getting tighter and tighter, and this is where they have to balance their obligations, their ideological obligations to the supreme leader of Iran, to Iran, and their obligations to their Shia support base in Lebanon, most of whom don't care about Iran. And that was easy in the 90s when the Israelis were occupying South Lebanon. We are resisting, an Israeli occupation on behalf of Lebanon. But it becomes more difficult now when they're fighting this devastating conflict, which could become a regional conflict against Israel for the sake of what? Hamas and Gaza. This is not a Lebanese issue. So life is not easy for Hezbollah, I would say, these days.
You're an astonishingly clear speaker, and we're very grateful to you. So thank you very much. And just making sure there aren't any more questions. Yes, I do have some more questions. So I'll just very quickly put these to you. How much support does Hezbollah have in Lebanon outside of the Palestinian community? And with my economist hat on, the pager attack is highlighting manufacturing licensing issues. What will be the response of companies? Was probably slightly outside your expertise, but it is an interesting point as to, like a lot of companies around the world now thinking, right, we need to think about what we're selling.
Well, you're right. It is above my pay grade answering that. But there have been a number of commentaries looking at the vulnerability of the supply chain. That's, from the manufacturing point to the retail point or the buying point. If, in this case, it looks like Mossad interfered. But potentially you could have a nefarious organization doing much the same kind of thing. But I can't really comment on that. But in terms of Hezbollah's support outside the Shia community, rather more than the Palestinian community, Palestinians support Hezbollah by and large because Hezbollah supports the Palestinian cause and they've bled for it. Outside the Shia community, there is some support for Hezbollah, but it's pretty limited. So these would be some political parties, perhaps close to Syria and strongly opposed to Israel. There are parties like the Ba'ath Party, the Syrian Social Nationalist Party, who are kind of allied to Hezbollah, but don't share Hezbollah's ideological traits and so on. And Hezbollah has a political alliance with a large Christian party, which is looking more and more afraid. I think, and depending how this all ends up, God forbid this doesn't turn into a regional war, which will be hugely devastating for Lebanon. It's going to be bad enough for Israel, but I think Lebanon will be turned into a car park. And in the aftermath, nobody's going to turn around and say, well, thank you very much, Hezbollah, for that. All for the sake of Hamas and Gaza. No, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And it's been a tour de force, and we're very grateful for your understanding and your ability to communicate it. So thank you very much. And from all of us here, goodbye.